Martin Luther King Jr. by Josh Gregory. Chapter 4. King stood behind President Lyndon B. Johnson as he signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act into law. Far from finished. On July 2, 1964, the Civil Rights Act became law. The act was the greatest victory yet for King and the civil rights movement. It outlawed segregation throughout the country. It also added new legal protections to prevent discrimination by employers and to ensure voting rights. For his role in such an important change, King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. King also spoke out against U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Young activists protest voting laws in Selma on February 5, 1965. More than 400 people were arrested during the protest in Selma. Problems at the polls. Even with the new laws in place, local governments in the South found ways to prevent black people from voting. In early 1965, King traveled to Selma, Alabama, to begin a protest for stronger voting right laws. He led several marches through the city. He was once again arrested along with hundreds of fellow protesters. After his release from jail, King helped organize a march from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery. The long march would demonstrate the activists' determination and bring public attention to their efforts. Hundreds of protesters gathered in Selma on March 7, 1965, to begin the march. However, the Alabama State Police blocked their path and beat them with clubs. King had been preaching at his church in Montgomery. He was horrified to hear about the violence. Police mercilessly beat protesters with clubs to prevent the march from Selma to Montgomery. The Voting Rights Act. King personally led a second march a few days later. Once again, state police blocked the marchers. This time, King and his followers turned back to avoid violence. Mounting pressure from the rest of the nation soon forced the Alabama governor to relent. On March 21st, King led thousands of protesters to Montgomery without police interference. The protest raised awareness of voting rights violations and led to the Voting Rights Act of August 1965. Thousands of people followed King on the march to Montgomery. King met with President Lyndon Johnson on March 18, 1966. Heading north. Though discrimination was more openly practiced in the South, it affected black people throughout the country. In cities such as Los Angeles and Chicago, local laws made it hard for black people to move into white neighborhoods. This often forced them to live in poor, rundown areas. In 1966, King and his family moved to a poor black neighborhood in Chicago. There, he planned to draw attention to the city's unfair housing situation. King speaks to a huge crowd at Chicago's Soldier Field. Struggling in Chicago. In Chicago, King led marches and other peaceful protests as he had throughout the South. However, these demonstrations made little difference in the city's situation. Chicago's leaders argued that poverty and housing were not civil rights issues. In the face of such setbacks, many African Americans began embracing a different approach to fight racism. A new approach. Leaders such as Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael encouraged black nationalism over King's plan of integration. They argued that King's peaceful methods were not powerful enough to win truly equal treatment. Instead, black nationalists believed that black people should remain separate from white people. They would gain equality by increasing their own power in government and business. Black nationalists also believed that black people should fight back against violent attacks. The fight against poverty. In the following years, King focused heavily on battling poverty and winning rights for workers. He began planning another march in Washington, D.C. This one would address not only civil rights for black people, but also the issue of poverty among all races. In 1968, King's work brought him to Memphis, Tennessee. There he planned to support a group of workers who were on strike. King leads a march to support the striking workers in Memphis on March 28, 1968. King's friends point in the direction of the shooter as King falls to the floor. James Earl Ray eventually took back his confession and denied shooting King. A tragic loss. On the evening of April 4th, 1968, King walked out on the balcony of his hotel in Memphis. As he was talking with some fellow activists, a shot rang out. King was hit by a bullet. He was quickly taken to the hospital, but there was nothing the doctors could do. He died that evening. A white man named James Earl Ray later admitted to the murder. Mourning a hero. The nation was shaken by the loss of the great leader. Riots broke out in many cities, and dozens of people died in the chaos. World leaders such as President Lyndon Johnson and Pope Paul VI expressed their sadness at the loss of this great man. King's funeral was held on April 9th. Tens of thousands of mourners gathered in the streets outside his father's church in Atlanta to pay their respects. Timeline of Martin Luther King Jr. January 15th, 1929. Martin Luther King Jr. is born in Atlanta, Georgia. June 18th, 1953. King marries Coretta Scott. April 1963. King and other activists are arrested and jailed in Birmingham, Alabama. August 28th, 1963. King delivers his I Have a Dream speech in Washington, D.C. April 4th, 1968. King is murdered in Memphis, Tennessee. A remarkable legacy. Martin Luther King Jr. is remembered as one of the United States' greatest heroes. His aspiring leadership helped bring about some of the most important changes in the country's history. Thanks to his work, African Americans were able to make great strides forward in the battle against discrimination. As the struggle to win equal rights for all Americans continues today, King's contributions will never be forgotten. True statistics. Number of people at the Washington March, around 250.